October 26, 1944. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and the acrid tang of gunpowder, a constant reminder of the brutal struggle consuming the Hurtgen forest. For days, the American 9th Infantry Division had been grinding through the unforgiving terrain, pushing towards the Ruhr River, a seemingly insurmountable watery barrier that guarded the path into the German heartland. Now, at a critical bend in the river near the shattered remains of a village once called Eschweiler, their advance had stalled. Before them lay a gaping chasm where the Eschweiler Bridge once stood, a victim of German demolition charges. On the far bank, unseen but keenly felt, were the enemy, dug in and ready. Machine gun nests commanded the ruined crossing, and artillery observation posts scanned every approach. The Ruhr, swollen by autumn rains, flowed swiftly, an icy, indifferent adversary. Colonel Douglas Macmillan, commander of the 29th Engineer Battalion, stood on the muddy bank, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He surveyed the torrent, then the grim faces of his men. The standard procedure was clear. Bring up the pontoon bridging equipment, lay down a temporary crossing, and pray the Germans did not discover them before it was complete. He turned to Major Ernst Schneider, his senior operations officer. "How long, Ernst?" Macmillan's voice was tight, a thinly veiled frustration. Schneider, a meticulous officer with decades of engineering experience, consulted his notes. "Sir, with the current conditions, and accounting for enemy observation, we're looking at a minimum of 36 hours for a heavy pontoon bridge, likely 48, perhaps even more, if we face significant interdiction." 36 to 48 hours, the number hung in the cold air like a death sentence. Every minute counted. General Barton, the division commander, had made it clear the breakthrough was imminent, but it required crossing the Ruhr. Delays here would cost lives further up the line, disrupt the entire offensive, and allow the Germans to bring up reinforcements. The infantry, exhausted and exposed, huddled in foxholes, staring across the river. They knew what those numbers meant. Days, not hours. Days of waiting under German artillery, days of being fixed in place, a tempting target. Sergeant Frank Miller of the 2nd Battalion, 39th Infantry Regiment, watched the engineers unpack their heavy equipment, his face a mask of weariness. He'd seen this before. It was a slow, deliberate dance, vulnerable at every step. His men needed to cross, and they needed to cross yesterday. The air was thick with the despair of the impossible. The engineers, highly trained and resourceful, were already setting up their preparation areas, their movements betraying a grim determination. They knew the drill, the massive rubber pontoons, the heavy timber decking, the complex anchoring systems. It was all standard, proven, but agonizingly slow. It was how bridges were built in combat. Macmillan rubbed his temples. "We don't have that kind of time, Ernst. The general's orders are explicit. We push through." But how? The river was too wide for a simple assault bridge, too deep and swift for fording. The remnants of the old bridge offered no foundation. It was a classic military engineering dilemma, one that had been solved the same way for generations. Build a pontoon bridge slowly and painfully, or find another crossing miles away, losing crucial momentum. Unbeknownst to the command, a vastly different idea was already brewing in the mind of one Captain Benjamin Carter, a junior officer in Macmillan's own battalion. His plan, if anyone heard it, would sound preposterous, an engineer's pipe dream, perhaps even a suicidal fantasy. Yet it was born not of fantasy, but of a unique and unorthodox perspective, one honed not in the rigid doctrines of military academies, but in the raw, unforgiving world of industrial construction. His thesis, unspoken but firm, was this: what if the entire conventional wisdom about building bridges in combat was simply wrong? What if the objective wasn't to float over the water, but to simply get across it, using a method so audacious, so contrary to established procedure, that the enemy wouldn't even recognize it as a bridge until it was too late? He believed he could accomplish in minutes what would take days, but first he had to convince an army steeped in tradition to embrace the truly ridiculous. Captain Benjamin Carter was not your typical army engineer. At 28, he possessed a quiet intensity, a sharp analytical mind, and hands calloused not just by military drills, but by years spent wrestling with concrete and steel. Before the war had pulled him into uniform, Carter had been a lead foreman on several ambitious civilian construction projects across the American Midwest. He'd built dams, overseen the rapid construction of factory foundations, and even designed temporary cofferdams for river diversions. His pre-war experience was less about textbook military doctrine and more about practical, on-the-fly problem-solving, often under immense pressure and tight deadlines. He'd learned to improvise with whatever materials were available, to see unconventional solutions where others saw only obstacles. This background, while invaluable in theory, often put him at odds with the more traditional by-the-book officers within the Corps. The tactical situation at the Ruhr River crossing was deteriorating rapidly. German reconnaissance flights had spotted the American buildup, and though the enemy had not yet opened fire with their full force, sporadic artillery shells began to whistle overhead, landing with sickening thuds in the muddy fields behind the American lines. Casualties, though light so far, were a grim precursor of what awaited the waiting infantry. Sergeant Frank Miller watched a shell explode near a supply truck, sending a geyser of mud and debris skyward. His company was pinned down, and every minute they remained static, the more vulnerable they became. General Barton was demanding action, pushing for a river crossing before the window of opportunity slammed shut. German panzer divisions were rumored to be on the move, and if they arrived before the Americans could establish a foothold on the east bank, the entire offensive could collapse. It was against this backdrop of mounting desperation that Captain Carter presented his proposal. He approached Colonel Macmillan and Major Schneider in their command tent, a temporary structure smelling of canvas and stale coffee. "Sir, I believe I have a method to cross the Ruhr, not in days, but in a matter of hours, perhaps even less." Macmillan, exhausted and beleaguered, looked up, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Carter, we've reviewed every known engineering solution, the current, the depth, the enemy's position. There's no magic bullet here. We're assembling the pontoons. Get your men ready." Carter, undeterred, laid out a crude sketch on the map table. "Sir, we're not building a pontoon bridge. We're building a submerged causeway." He explained his idea. Instead of floating bulky pontoons on the surface, they would use hollow steel sections, salvaged or rapidly fabricated, fill them with water as ballast, and rapidly sink them in a predetermined pattern across the riverbed. Once submerged and stable, they would form a solid, albeit submerged, foundation. Then, using pre-cut timber sections, they would lay a simple temporary deck directly on top, just above the waterline. The speed would come from the simplicity of the components and the rapid sinking method. "It's a trick, sir. A ridiculous one, perhaps, but it's fast," Major Schneider scoffed. "Submerged sections? Captain, that's unstable, highly susceptible to current scour, and utterly unproven in combat conditions. We'd need precise depth soundings, perfectly level riverbeds, and a miracle to connect them under fire. It's a civilian construction fantasy, not a military solution." Colonel Macmillan sighed. "Carter, I appreciate your initiative, but we don't have time for experiments. We stick to doctrine." But the infantry commanders were growing restless. Captain Robert Jensen, leading a company of the 39th, had overheard snippets of the conversation. He approached the tent, his uniform splattered with mud. "Colonel, with all due respect, if Captain Carter has an idea that gets us across faster than 48 hours, we need to hear him out. My men are sitting ducks out here. Every minute we wait, we lose more." Jensen's desperate plea resonated. Macmillan, though skeptical, could not ignore the raw reality. He gave Carter a grudging 30 minutes to present a detailed plan. The initial rejection, though firm, had a sliver of desperation in it, a crack in the wall of conventional thinking that Carter was determined to exploit. Captain Carter seized the opportunity. His voice, usually reserved, took on a confident edge as he detailed his rapid submerged truss bridge technique. The core of his innovation lay in simplicity and speed. Traditional military bridging focused on robust, reusable structures designed for long-term use. Carter's bridge was deliberately temporary, almost disposable, designed solely for the immediate need of getting infantry and light vehicles across a gap. He proposed using a series of standardized hollow steel box sections, roughly 20 feet long, 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep. These weren't custom fabricated for the army. Instead, Carter had identified abandoned factories and railway sidings in the recently liberated towns where such sections, originally intended for industrial frameworks or even water tanks, could be found or quickly adapted. Each section would be fitted with a series of quick-release valves, allowing them to be rapidly filled with river water acting as ballast. Crucially, each section would also have robust interlocking connectors at its ends, designed for quick, albeit temporary, securement to adjacent sections. "The trick, gentlemen," Carter explained, pointing to his sketch, "is not to float them, but to sink them. We'll pre-position them in the water, fill them with ballast, and let the current do some of the work, settling them onto the riverbed in a pre-planned line. The interlocks will hold them in place against the current." He then described the decking, simple pre-cut timber planks, 4 inches thick, 12 feet long. These would be carried by hand and quickly laid across the top edges of the submerged steel sections, forming a narrow but functional roadway. "It won't be pretty," Carter admitted, "and it won't take tanks, but it will get 1,000 GIs and their light equipment across in under an hour once the foundation is laid." The contrast with standard military bridging procedures was stark. A typical M1 pontoon bridge involved hundreds of individual components, heavy crane work, extensive anchoring, and a team of specialists working methodically. It was a marvel of engineering, but slow and vulnerable. Carter's method, by contrast, relied on brute force improvisation and an almost reckless disregard for textbook perfection. Major Schneider, ever the stickler for doctrine, remained unconvinced. "Captain, the current alone could shift those sections, and if one shifts, the whole line could be compromised. This is a house of cards, not a bridge." Colonel Macmillan voiced his concern. "And what about German artillery? Those sections are targets, and once submerged, they're difficult to repair or adjust." But Captain Robert Jensen, the infantry commander, saw something else. He saw hope. "Colonel, if it gets my men across faster than their artillery can zero in, I don't care if it's held together with spit and baling wire. We're taking casualties just waiting here." He looked at Carter. "How fast, Captain? Give me a number." Carter, his eyes fixed on Macmillan, stated his statistics. "Sir, a standard heavy pontoon bridge, under ideal conditions, can take 24 hours to deploy. Under these combat conditions, Major Schneider estimates 36 to 48. My method, with adequate materials and trained personnel, I project we can have the submerged foundation laid and the decking in place in 3 to 4 hours. The actual crossing of infantry could commence within an hour of the first plank being laid. That's a minimum of 30 hours saved, perhaps 40. The numbers were staggering, almost unbelievable. 30 hours. In combat, 30 hours was an eternity, enough time to turn the tide of an entire battle. The psychological resistance from by-the-book officers like Schneider was palpable, but the desperate need for speed from the infantry commanders was beginning to sway Macmillan. With General Barton's urgent demands echoing in his ears and the infantry's desperate pleas for a solution, Colonel Macmillan made a difficult decision. "All right, Carter, you've got 3 hours to prove your concept. Scrounge what you need. My men are yours, but if this fails, we go back to the books and you'll be answering to the general." It was a grudging approval, but it was enough. The next few hours were a whirlwind of frantic, organized chaos. Captain Carter, with a small team of engineers and a detachment of infantry volunteers, scoured the nearby, partially demolished villages. Abandoned factories yielded heavy gauge steel plating, twisted but salvageable. A bombed-out railway yard provided old freight car frames and sections of track. Even the structural steel from a partially destroyed church was pressed into service. These materials were quickly cut, welded, and adapted into the hollow box sections Carter needed. The makeshift workshop buzzed with the roar of acetylene torches and the clang of hammers. Private First Class Thomas O'Malley, a young engineer from Ohio, worked tirelessly, his face streaked with grease and sweat. He had initially scoffed at Carter's crazy idea, but seeing the captain's unwavering focus, O'Malley threw himself into the task. Meanwhile, other soldiers, including Sergeant Frank Miller's men, were tasked with felling trees and rapidly sawing timber into the precise dimensions required for the decking. The air filled with the whine of portable saws and the thud of falling wood. This wasn't standard military engineering. It was more akin to an emergency civilian construction project, driven by raw necessity and the ingenuity of desperate men. German reconnaissance observed the unusual activity. Luftwaffe pilots, flying high above the Ruhr, reported a significant increase in vehicle movement behind American lines and unusual construction activity near the destroyed bridge. However, their intelligence officers, steeped in conventional military doctrine, misinterpreted the reports. They expected pontoon bridge components, and what they saw did not match their expectations. They noted the haphazard collection of materials, the seemingly random stockpiling of twisted steel and felled timber, and concluded the Americans were either attempting a feint or simply clearing debris. They saw no organized assembly of bridging components. This misinterpretation became a critical, unforeseen advantage for Carter's ridiculous trick. As dusk bled into a frigid, moonless night, the tension on the riverbanks became almost unbearable. Rumors of an imminent German panzer counterattack grew louder, fueled by intercepted radio chatter and reports from forward patrols. The time window was closing fast. Soldiers like Private John Davis, an infantryman from Miller's company, felt a cold dread creep into his bones. He'd spent the last hour helping haul rough-cut planks, his hands raw. He looked across the river, imagining the German guns zeroing in on their position. "If this doesn't work, we're cooked," he muttered to Sergeant Miller. Miller, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, just grunted. "We'll cross, one way or another." The weather worsened. A biting wind whipped off the Ruhr, carrying with it the smell of ice and decay. Rain began to fall, turning the already muddy banks into a slick, treacherous morass. Despite the conditions, the engineers and infantry volunteers pressed on. Carter moved among them, his voice calm but firm, offering encouragement and correcting mistakes. Sergeant Reynolds, an experienced NCO who had initially been skeptical, now worked alongside Carter, his years of practical experience allowing him to quickly grasp the nuances of the improvised technique. He marveled at the speed with which the cobbled-together components were taking shape. The sensory details of the preparation were stark: the metallic tang of newly cut steel, the rhythmic thud of mallets on timber, the roar of generator-powered lights cutting through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the focused, strained faces of the men. Each man, whether engineer or infantry, understood the stakes. Their lives and the success of the entire offensive hinged on the audacity of Captain Carter's unconventional idea. The execution began precisely at Odo 200 hours, under the cover of dense fog and the insistent drizzle. The air was thick with the growl of bulldozers scraping paths to the river's edge, the grinding of crane engines, and the muffled shouts of men. Captain Carter, standing ankle-deep in the icy water, directed the placement of the first hollow steel sections. Each section, now fitted with internal ballast tanks and rudimentary quick-release mechanisms, was carefully lowered by cranes onto the riverbed. The process was painstakingly slow at first, as engineers in shallow draft boats guided the immense sections into position. Once positioned, the valves were opened, and the Ruhr's frigid water rushed in, rapidly sinking the steel boxes. A series of underwater divers, specially trained for this task, worked in pairs, battling the strong current and near-zero visibility to secure the interlocking connectors between the submerged sections. Unexpected challenges arose almost immediately. The riverbed, assumed to be relatively uniform, proved to be uneven in places, causing some sections to settle at awkward angles. A powerful eddy near the central channel threatened to sweep an unsecured section downstream. Carter, without hesitation, plunged into the water, shouting orders to the crane operator and directing a team of men with heavy ropes to secure the rogue section. His quick adaptations and problem-solving were crucial. He ordered sandbags to be filled and dropped onto the misaligned sections, forcing them into a more stable position. Suddenly, a flare arced high into the night sky, blooming into an eerie green light directly over their position. German reconnaissance had finally understood. The bridge was no longer a theoretical threat, it was becoming a reality. Seconds later, the first German artillery shells shrieked through the air, impacting upstream and downstream of the crossing point, sending geysers of water and mud skyward. Machine gun fire erupted from the far bank, tracers arcing through the fog like malevolent fireflies. Colonel Macmillan, observing from a small command post, felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. He watched as his men, exposed and vulnerable, continued their work under intense fire. Major Schneider, beside him, could only grit his teeth. He was right about the enemy reaction, sir, just not about the timing. Captain Robert Jensen, the infantry commander, immediately ordered his forward elements to lay down suppressive fire, attempting to silence the German machine gun nests. Private John Davis, one of Jensen's men, gripped his rifle, firing blindly into the fog-shrouded darkness across the river. He could hear the screams of wounded engineers and the clang of shrapnel against the steel sections. Yet, through it all, Carter's calm voice carried above the din, directing, cajoling, inspiring. Sergeant Reynolds, with a small team, continued laying the pre-cut timber decking, moving with astonishing speed, each plank thudding into place, forming a narrow, wet and utterly vital pathway. The bridge was taking shape, plank by agonizing plank, even as the world around them erupted in fire and steel. The visceral details were overwhelming. The acrid smell of high explosives mixing with the damp earth, the bone-jarring concussions, the taste of fear in every breath. The crossing accelerated with a momentum born of desperation and sheer will. As the first planks of the improvised deck were laid, Captain Carter waved forward the waiting infantry. Sergeant Frank Miller's platoon was among the first. He hesitated for only a second, looking at the narrow, slippery pathway stretching into the fog. It was nothing like the sturdy, familiar bridges he'd crossed before. But the alternative was death by artillery, waiting on the exposed bank. "Move it, boys!" he yelled, and with a surge of adrenaline, he led his men onto the rapidly expanding causeway. The GIs moved in a low crouch, rifles held high, their boots splashing on the wet timber. The structure swayed perceptibly under the weight of dozens of men, but it held. Within 30 minutes of the first plank being laid, a steady stream of American infantry was pouring across the Ruhr. The speed was astounding, a stark contrast to the sluggish pace of traditional pontoon bridge construction. What would have taken an entire day or even two was now being accomplished in mere minutes. The Germans, initially stunned by the audacity of the crossing, redoubled their efforts to destroy the bridge. Artillery shells rained down with increased ferocity. A near miss struck one of the submerged steel sections, sending a tremor through the entire structure and causing a small section of decking to splinter. Sergeant Reynolds and Private First Class O'Malley, without a moment's hesitation, rushed to the damaged area, working under a hail of fire to replace the broken planks and reinforce the slightly buckled section with additional timber. Their quick actions prevented a collapse, demonstrating both the fragility and the surprising resilience of Carter's design. The critical moments came one after another. A German sniper picked off an engineer directing traffic, but another man immediately stepped in to take his place. A small German counterattack, realizing the bridge was the key, attempted to reach the far bank and destroy it directly. But the initial waves of American infantry, now safely across, established a hasty defensive perimeter, repelling the enemy with fierce fighting. The sound of small arms fire mingled with the continuous roar of artillery. Individual acts of courage were commonplace. A medic crawling onto the bridge to aid a fallen soldier, a corporal diving into the river to secure a loose rope, an engineer calmly hammering nails even as bullets ricocheted around him. The bridge, simple and brutal, held. 1,000 men, then 1,200, then 1,500 GIs, along with light jeeps and supply carts, streamed across the Ruhr River. The sheer volume and speed of the crossing overwhelmed the German defenders, who simply could not bring enough accurate fire to bear on the rapidly moving targets. By dawn, just over 4 hours after the first steel section touched the water, the last of the lead infantry battalions were across. The bridge, scarred but functional, stood as a testament to audacious engineering. The final statistics were irrefutable. Captain Carter's ridiculous bridge had allowed the rapid crossing of over 2,000 men and their equipment in under 5 hours, a feat previously considered impossible under combat conditions. The immediate tactical impact of Captain Carter's rapid submerged truss bridge, was profound and decisive. The unexpected speed of the crossing allowed the 9th Infantry Division to establish a strong bridgehead on the Ruhr's east bank before the German counterattack, spearheaded by panzer elements, could fully materialize. The German tanks, arriving hours later than anticipated due to the speed of the American advance, found a well-defended perimeter rather than an exposed, vulnerable beachhead. This blunted their assault, forcing them to regroup and allowing the Americans to consolidate their gains. The breakthrough across the Ruhr River proved to be a pivotal moment in the offensive, maintaining the momentum needed to push deeper into Germany. The strategic implications rippled through the Allied command. Reports of the impossible bridge reached General Omar Bradley's desk, highlighting the value of unorthodox solutions in stalemated situations. Morale among the American troops soared. They had witnessed firsthand how ingenuity and courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The method, initially dismissed as a civilian fantasy, was quickly recognized as a viable, albeit specialized, technique for rapid, short-term river crossings. Word spread, and within weeks Captain Carter was dispatched to other units, demonstrating his method. Though not suitable for all situations, variations of his technique were quietly adopted, influencing military engineering doctrine for specific scenarios where speed trumped long-term durability. Training manuals were updated, incorporating simplified versions of the rapid submerged causeway. For Captain Benjamin Carter, the war continued, but his reputation was cemented. He designed and oversaw the construction of several other critical, albeit less dramatic, crossings throughout the final months of the European campaign. After the war, he returned to the United States, declining offers for rapid promotion within the military. He chose to apply his wartime lessons to civilian life, embarking on a distinguished career in heavy construction. He designed innovative bridge foundations for challenging river crossings and became known for his ability to find elegant, practical solutions to complex engineering problems. His legacy was not just a temporary bridge in 1944, but a philosophy of engineering that prioritized adaptable, efficient, and sometimes unconventional thinking. The broader reflection on innovation in warfare and the tension between practical experience versus formal training became a recurring theme in the discussion surrounding Carter's feat. His success highlighted the critical role of individual initiative in changing outcomes, particularly when established procedures faltered under pressure. Time, as he had proven, could be a weapon in itself, and the psychology of risk-taking, when informed by expertise and audacity, could yield extraordinary results. The Ruhr River in the autumn of 1944 had been transformed from an impassable barrier into a mere inconvenience, a testament to human will and the power of a single audacious idea. The historical significance of Captain Carter's ridiculous bridge lay not just in the thousands of lives it saved or the strategic advantage it provided, but in its profound demonstration that sometimes the most effective solutions are found outside the confines of conventional wisdom. It was a stark reminder that innovation under pressure, even in the most rigid of environments, can turn the tide of history. This technique, refined and adapted, continued to influence military engineering for decades, particularly in the development of modular bridging systems and rapid deployment methods. While more sophisticated solutions emerged, the core principle of rapid, almost disposable crossings for specific combat needs had been etched into the doctrine. Colonel Douglas Macmillan, initially skeptical, became one of Carter's staunchest advocates, often recounting the story of the mad engineer who saved his division. Major Ernst Schneider, while never fully shedding his adherence to doctrine, openly admitted that Carter had taught him a valuable lesson about the limits of established rules. Sergeant Frank Miller, who had led his men across that precarious structure, carried the memory of the crossing throughout his life, telling his grandchildren about the craziest, bravest thing he'd ever seen. Captain Benjamin Carter himself, years later, would often look at the magnificent steel bridges he helped design, sometimes pausing to reflect on that cold, dark night on the Ruhr, where a simple, ridiculous trick had changed everything. The Ruhr no longer raged but flowed peacefully, yet the ghosts of determination and ingenuity lingered on its banks, a powerful image of human courage. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to our channel for more tales of human ingenuity and courage from history's most pivotal moments. Your support helps us continue to bring these forgotten stories to life.